Before we begin, a quick note on sources. There are two major records for the life and work of Omm Sety. For her life, there is a biography by Jonathan Cott in collaboration with Hani el-Zaini that is titled The Search for Omm Sety. For her work, there is a book written by Omm Sety herself, again in collaboration with Hani el-Zaini, that is titled Abydos, the Holy City of Ancient Egypt. I have used both of these books extensively in my research, with most of the anecdotes and personal references coming from Cott. I have also included excerpts from an old BBC documentary about Omm Sety that is available freely on YouTube. I'll include links to all of these sources in the episode description should you wish to access them. Salam alaikum, peace be upon you. Iri nini en chen, I make a welcome for you. Hello, and welcome back to the History of Egypt podcast, episode 190, Omm Sety, Guardian of Abydos. Today, we take a break from our historical narrative, the 19th dynasty and the reign of Sety I. Instead, we are sharing the story of an individual with a deep spiritual and physical connection to Sety and his great temple at Abydos. Dorothy Eady, also known as Omm Sety, was an English woman who lived at Abydos for many years, and she had a most interesting connection with this place. In some stories, Omm Sety claimed to have lived a past life at the temple itself. Supposedly, she had been a young girl who grew up around the time of the 19th dynasty, and she was left at the Temple of Sety in Abydos, where she was raised as a temple priestess. Omm Sety came to these conclusions following an accident as a child, and her beliefs led her on a fascinating path, both in a personal and professional capacity. Omm Sety is an intriguing figure, one that, in my opinion, deserves greater recognition as an Egyptologist and a devotee or guardian of Egypt's wonderful monuments. Today, the story of Omm Sety is most commonly discussed within the spiritual and New Age communities. Discussions of past lives, reincarnation, and spiritual connections with the ancient past are the most common forums in which this lady is discussed. In my opinion, that focus on her possible life in the 14th century BCE does a great disservice to her physical life in the 20th century CE. Ideas of reincarnation and the ancient past are central to Omm Sety's tale, and we will engage with those as they appear in her story. But I also want to shine the spotlight on her genuine work as an Egyptologist, as an archaeologist, and as a protector of the monuments of Abydos. Omm Sety is a fascinating figure. As you will see, her life has many wonderful tales. Dorothy Eady was born in January 1904. Her mother was named Caroline, her father was named Reuben. He was a master tailor who later purchased a cinema. The family lived in Blackheath in southeastern London, and they apparently had a traditional middle-class existence. That was until 1907, when, age 3, young Dorothy had a strange experience. The story goes that, you know what? I think I will let her describe it herself. Ms. Eady?
Well, it's a rather odd story. When I was 3 years old, I fell downstairs and, of course, knocked unconscious. My parents fetched the doctor, who examined me very carefully and said I was dead. And as I was the one and only, and the apple of my mother's eye, I mean, she went off the deep end and everybody was fussing around her. And I was left in my room lying on the bed. And then the doctor said he'd return in an hour with a nurse to wash the body and the death certificate, which he did. When he came back with the nurse and went into my room, the dead body was sitting on the bed playing, nothing the matter.
Dead body was you?
Yes.
After suffering a fall, the 3-year-old Dorothy was pronounced dead by the local doctor. And yet, clearly, she was not. Subsequently, life returned to normal, and young Ms. Eady seemed to have no visible long-term injuries. However, the story subsequently took a turn.
Nothing, there was no visible injuries or anything, but after that, I kept crying and saying I want to go home. And of course I was assured that I was at home, and I was equally sure that I was not. And I started dreaming about this temple here in Abydos. I dreamt about it not as a ruin, but as a going concern. But it wasn't until I was about 6, and I saw a photograph of this temple in a magazine, but of course, as it is, now ruined. Once I recognized this place. This was the place where I was dreaming of, and it was my home. Also, a photo of the mummy of King Sety. I knew that man. He's a nice man, good, kind man. Of course, I was assured that I never did know him. And of course, when my father explained to me about what the temple was and where it was, well, that explained to me why I wanted to go there and wasn't able to, because it wasn't where I am, or I wasn't where it was.
So following her accident, the 3-year-old Dorothy Eady started complaining that she wanted to go home, somewhere that was not her family home in London. And at the age of 6, she identified the Temple of Abydos from a photograph in a magazine and insisted that this was the home to which she referred. We'll come back to those beliefs and their significance later. But for now, this was the beginning of Ms. Eady's journey, one that consumed her entire life. Over the next few years, young Ms. Eady began to show an increasing fascination, even devotion, to the monuments and history of ancient Egypt. She visited the British Museum repeatedly, in some cases even sneaking out of school to visit the institution. And somewhere along the way, she met a man named Ernest Wallace Budge. Budge is a familiar name to the Egyptological community. In the early 1900s, he was one of the most popular and influential scholars in ancient languages and religion. Today, Budge's work is severely outdated, and most academics do not use him. But at the time, he was a noteworthy figure. Budge worked for the British Museum, and in the course of that work, he noticed young Ms. Eady visiting the Egyptian galleries repeatedly. After speaking to her directly, Budge offered to teach Ms. Eady the language of ancient Egypt, and subsequently, he became her unofficial tutor in hieroglyphs. Budge gave Dorothy lessons in the ancient writings, especially texts like the Book of the Dead. He was impressed with her proficiency and quickness of learning, and supposedly, when he asked her how she picked it up so quickly, Dorothy explained that actually she already knew the language a long time ago, but she had subsequently forgotten, and now that Budge was training her, it was all coming back. This tutorship by Budge gave Ms. Eady a grounding in the basics of Egyptology, and this would serve her well in later years. By her own recollection, Dorothy's fascination and commitment to the ancient history of Egypt was evident from an extremely early age, and when asked about the origins of this interest, Dorothy would explain it in quite passionate terms. Once again, here is her account.
How did you explain this to yourself?
I didn't. I mean, to me, that I belonged there and I had to go there, and all my life, I would never say, if I go to Egypt. It was always when I go to Egypt.
When did you first go to the British Museum?
Oh, I went to the museum first of all when I was 4. But Mother said I wasn't taking any notice of anything till they got to the Egyptian department. And then I just went crazy. I went and sat down by a mummy in its glass case. When they were ready to leave and called me to come, I refused to come. So Mother came to pick me up. And she said, I yelled out, and in a very unusual voice, I said, leave me, these are my people.
Jonathan Cott's biography adds further detail to these recollections. Apparently, in one instance, Dorothy saw a photograph of an Egyptian mummy. This was the mummy of King Sety I, the second ruler of the 19th dynasty, and the builder of the Great Temple at Abydos. According to Cott's biography, quote, Dorothy, unable to restrain herself, rushed over excitedly to her father, and this time she swore to him that she really did know the man in the picture, Sety I, and that he was a nice and kind man. Reuben Eady, Dorothy's father, had had enough. Now he wound up yelling that she certainly didn't know and couldn't possibly ever have known the man in the photograph, that he was some old king who had been dead for 3,000 years, that he probably wasn't at all a nice man, and that she should and must stop all of this nonsense once and for all. End quote. Apparently, young Dorothy's obsession was starting to annoy people around her, and apparently she was even kicked out of her church Sunday school for, quote, Dorothy told her teacher that since Egyptian religion was thousands of years older than Christianity, it must be the true religion and Christianity merely its copy. After all, she asserted, weren't Osiris and Jesus both resurrected? Hadn't the Virgin Mary adopted some of the same characteristics as the goddess Isis? And didn't Joseph, Mary, and the infant Jesus closely resemble Osiris, Isis, and their son, Horus the Child? The Sunday school teacher's response was immediately to make an appointment with Mrs. Eady to request that she keep her, quote, heathenish daughter away from class. End quote. So, there were challenges that came with her passion. Over the next couple decades, Dorothy Eady remained in England. For a time, she worked at her father's cinema, providing a singing accompaniment to silent films of the 1920s. She became politically active, especially on the subject of Egypt and its independence from the British Empire. In the course of her activism, she met a man named Imam Abd el-Meguid. Imam also was politically active for Egyptian independence, and the two hit it off, eventually forming a relationship. This led, in 1933, to young Dorothy announcing that she and Imam were to be married, and at the age of 29, she packed her belongings, boarded a ship, and set sail for Egypt. Arriving in Egypt, Dorothy and Imam were married, and subsequently she took the first name Bulbul, which translates as nightingale. Apparently, Dorothy had an excellent singing voice, so that may be the origin of the name. The young couple took up residence with Imam's family in Cairo. At the time, the city had a significant English population, especially representatives and employees of the British imperial system. Bulbul, Dorothy, felt quite separate from that community. In her words, she was, quote, totally distant and estranged from my British countrymen, as if they were creatures from an alien world. And I, quite deservedly, earned the wrath of the city's British community because of my attitude toward it. End quote. Instead of a British imperial lifestyle, Dorothy wanted something more traditional. She found great appeal in the Egyptian way of life, their architecture, their food, and their customs. By her own account, there was some difficulty adjusting to the new way of life. Apparently her cooking was legendarily terrible. In one account, she tried to make kosheri, an Egyptian dish made with lentils, rice, onions, and tomatoes. But Bulbul's attempt at kosheri went so badly that she suggested her guests take it, quote, for external use only, as an ointment for boils and abscesses, end quote. By now, you may be getting a sense of Bulbul or Dorothy's personality, quite strong-willed but with a sense of humour, especially in the self-deprecating fashion. By her own accounts, these ups and downs in her experiences come across more as comical than sources of stress. But of course, adjusting to an entirely new country, culture, and way of life would have had its difficulties. Bulbul and Imam supposedly struggled over the place where they lived. He preferred an affluent suburb in the middle of Cairo, but Bulbul struggled with the English immigrants who surrounded them, and she described them as, quote, very snooty English people. Awful, awful people. My God, if there was ever a boring place, it was that suburb. End quote. By comparison, Bulbul preferred the older parts of Cairo, especially in the east near the Great Citadel. This did cause tension within the marriage, and, spoilers, Imam and Bulbul would not remain together forever. But there were some other wrinkles in the story before that took place. While adjusting to her new life in Cairo, Bulbul, Dorothy, became pregnant, and 9 months later she gave birth to a son. She insisted on naming this son Sety. The choice of name was significant, and it brings us to an interesting factor in her story around this time. In the early years of her marriage, Eady reports at least 2 instances of some supernatural visitation. She claims to have been visited by the ghost of King Sety I. Supposedly, this took place on 2 separate occasions, when the spectre of the pharaoh appeared beside her bed during the middle of the night. By Dorothy's account, these visitations actually had witnesses. On one occasion, her mother, who was visiting, saw the ghost of Sety standing beside her bed, and on another, her father-in-law saw the same thing. Once again, we only have Dorothy's account of these events, but this is the story as she told it. Subsequently, Dorothy would report many visitations by the ghost of King Sety. This would be an important part of her later story, and we will explore it at the proper moment. For now, though, Dorothy's early years in Egypt, her marriage to Imam Abd el-Meguid, was off to a slightly rocky start. The two had struggled to make a comfortable life in Cairo, and while they ultimately had a son named Sety, Ms. Eady was reporting strange occurrences. For 3 years, Bulbul, Dorothy, and Imam remained married. During this time, another curious set of experiences began to affect Ms. Eady. During the night, Dorothy began to awake and walk over to her desk. There, she would begin writing, apparently receiving dictation from some part of her subconscious or an external visitor. The story, as reported in Cott's biography, goes like this. Quote, "Most of the time when I was writing, I was rather unconscious, as though I were under a strange spell, neither asleep nor awake. I was being dictated to. The gentleman who was narrating my story, his name was Horus Ra, really took his time. He would just tell me a few words and then be absent for a fortnight or so, then come again, always at night, and relate to me another couple of lines or episodes. Every night when he came, I felt as though something were shaking me in order to wake me up, just as in a dream. When I was writing the bits and pieces of the story, I felt I was hearing a soft voice, without being able to see anybody. The nights were always moonlit, and somehow I was able to see my own handwriting. While I was being dictated to, I felt I understood every word, but later on, when I started to decipher the scribblings, I found they were quite difficult to understand. In fact, in the mornings when I woke up, everything seemed so vague, so uncertain, that if I hadn't been absolutely sure it was my own handwriting, I would have said it was somebody else's." End quote. In Dorothy's recollection, these nighttime visitations took place at a semi-regular interval over more than a year. The phenomenon apparently disturbed her husband greatly. Dorothy did not share what she was writing down with Imam, and this was upsetting to him. In her own account, Dorothy recalls, quote, "I wasn't sure he would believe it, and I wasn't sure anybody else would either." End quote. Eventually, the visitations by this Horus Ra stopped, and Dorothy received no further messages. When that happened, she began compiling everything that she had already written and put it together to reconstruct the story that she had been told. The tale, it transpired, was that of an ancient Egyptian girl named Bent Reshit, whom Dorothy believed may have been herself in a previous life. The story, as she describes it, goes as follows. Quote, "It took this Horus Ra almost a year to finish the story. After I'd finally translated and pieced together all of the writings, they came to about 70 pages. This is what I found out, and I think it's true because of things that I remember. My parents, it seemed, were of very humble origin. My mother was a vegetable seller who used to sell produce to the troops, and my father was a soldier stationed in the Shunet el-Zabib, an archaic fortress that had been turned into a military barracks about a mile to the north of Sety's temple. I don't know if my parents were married, possibly not. If they were married, it was short-lived. When I was born, my mother called me Bent Reshit, which means harp of joy. But she died when I was a little over 2 years old. My father, who had previously been sent on missions for weeks or months at a time, was soon transferred to the city of Thebes, and since he could not drag a 3-year-old baby along with him, he took her to the ancient temple at Kom el-Sultan, that is the great temple of Osiris, to the north of Seti's temple, there to be brought up as a priestess." End quote. Dorothy Eady, or the young girl she was describing, claims to have been born in the Abydos region. Apparently, her family lived at the Shunet el-Zebib, which today we know better as the enclosure of King Khasa Kemwi. This is located in the Abydos necropolis region. Dorothy mentions the enclosure being used as a fortress, and indeed that was one of the early interpretations by scholars in the 1800s when they first excavated these monuments. But more recently, excavations have explored these structures more thoroughly and discovered a great deal of ceremonial and religious material, but nothing related to the military. So Dorothy's interpretation is based on an older scholarly tradition. You can make of that what you will when it comes to her story, but that is something to note. So the young girl Bent Reshit, or Harp of Joy, goes to the Abydos temple, specifically the Temple of Osiris, at the site called Kom el-Sultan. This is a monument to the north of Seti's great temple, and it seems to be the ceremonial center of the Abydos township and village. Seti's monument is dedicated primarily to himself, but at Kom el-Sultan, we have the sort of ceremonial heart of the Osirian cult. It is within this priesthood that the tale of Bent Reshit, as told by Dorothy Eady, now continues. Quote, "The high priest at the temple of Osiris was called Intef, which is rather peculiar because that name was not fashionable at that time. He was tall, with a stern face, and he used to scare the wits out of all the priestesses whenever they heard his low baritone voice. His shaven head, his immaculate clothes, and his imposing figure commanded respect. He was the prototype of the Egyptian aristocrat, a very distinguished but frightening person indeed." When Bent Reshit, the young girl, was 12 years old, the priest Intef asked her if she wanted to go out into the world or remain in the temple. If she wanted to go out into the world and find herself a nice husband, well, goodbye and God bless you. But she didn't know anything about the world outside, and she was happy in the temple, so she said she would rather stay. Intef then explained to her that she must make a vow to become a virgin, because she would now become temple property. Being only 12 years old, Bent Reshit did not quite realize the meaning of it all, but having nowhere else to go, she took her vows. End quote. So far, Dorothy Eady has not pinpointed the date of the story, but working backwards from her later accounts, we can place it somewhere around 1310 BCE, the end of the 18th dynasty and the start of the 19th. Her choice of Intef as the name of the priest is noteworthy, because that name is more commonly associated with the First Intermediate Period and early Middle Kingdom, several centuries earlier than Dynasty 19. Beyond that, the details are rather formulaic. You will note that she gives the priest an archetypal description as a shaved-head but stern individual, a kind of authority figure in the classic Egyptian mold. You would find a figure like this Intef in many statues and wall carvings that depict ancient Egyptian priests. So if you are approaching the story critically, you will note the archetypal description of Intef. Anyway, Bent Reshit, about 12 years old, decides to continue within the temple. She now joins the priesthood of Osiris officially and serves within that cult. The story goes, quote, "For the next couple of years, Bent Reshit was taught by the high priest himself the role that she would be enacting in the performances of the death and resurrection of Osiris, a role that only virgins, vowed as priestesses of Isis from their childhood, were allowed to play. They received a very arduous training. This Intef fellow was quite severe, a real fundamentalist, so to speak, because the priestesses were not supposed to make any mistakes whatsoever when reciting the religious hymns during the performance of the mysteries." End quote. so Bint Reshit was given an education as a performer who worked in the temple and would participate in the festivals and celebrations of Osiris. At this point, Dorothy's story takes a tangent into describing those rituals, and I'll include that at the end of the episode. For now, this is the beginning of the story as Dorothy told it, but it would grow in the future. Dorothy, or Bulbul's life, was taking a curious direction, and it certainly took a toll on her relationships. About 3 years after their wedding, Dorothy's husband Imam filed for divorce. Subsequently, he travelled overseas to Iraq, and following that, Dorothy left their home in that fashionable centre of Cairo and moved closer to Giza. At this point, the tale of Dorothy Eady comes to its end, and we start to hear the tale of Omm Sety. After the break, we will explore Omm Sety's life following her divorce from Imam. Her experiences, and more importantly, her work, would develop in fascinating ways. She would make acquaintances and friendships with leading Egyptologists, and she would contribute significantly to archaeological and historical studies. In short, her career was getting started, and yet Dorothy would continue to feel the pull to another place and to another life. That is after the break. See you in a moment. Dorothy Eady, Bulbul Abd el-Meguid, remained in Cairo for 19 years. In that time, she focused on her marriage, at least during the early period. She raised her young son, Sety, and she started to undertake Egyptological work. Dorothy Eady, Bulbul, was committed to her project, and she began to learn the ins and outs of archaeology, documentation, and good old excavation. In other words, while she had not undertaken a formal university education, she was fully committed to the practical aspects of Egyptology. Soon, she started to work on major excavations. One of Dorothy's early commissions was the archaeological project at Dashur. An Egyptian scholar named Ahmed Fakhri was leading excavations around the pyramids of King Sneferu. Fakhri knew Dorothy Eady, or Bulbul, and he commissioned her as his secretary, at least officially. Anecdotally though, Dorothy was far more involved in the excavation, and particularly the documentation process, than you might expect from such a job title. A German scholar, Klaus Bayer, knew Dorothy during this part of her life, and he described her work as follows, quote, "She was engaged in filing, record-keeping, and cataloguing, and trying to fit together all of the fragmentary material that was coming out of the Dashur excavations. In fact, she was more of a research assistant than a secretary, although she was making ends meet on a secretarial salary. I used to see her frequently. She told me nothing about her former life, quote-unquote, but she did tell me a good deal about her religious beliefs, her worship of Osiris, and about an occasion when Osiris had appeared to her, and the way in which the ancient Egyptian gods, whom she worshipped, had protected her. Dorothy Eady had visions, and she worshipped the ancient Egyptian gods, but she fully accepted scholarship, and she understood the methods and standards of scholarship, which is usually not the case with nuts. And she knew that she wasn't going to convince anybody else about her personal beliefs, nor did she desire to convert anybody. She herself was personally a believer, but she wasn't about to make a nuisance of herself, forcing her ideas on me or anyone else. I spent a good deal of time with her, and she never tried. Bayer even described a time when they visited Saqqara together, and they went to the Pyramid of Unas, a 5th dynasty monument with the earliest example of the pyramid texts. As Bayer recalls it, quote, "She brought along an offering, and she took off her shoes before entering the pyramid." End quote. Bayer's comments are brief, but he seems to have the utmost respect for Dorothy's commitment to Egyptology and her personal attunement to the ancient practices. This would be a recurring theme among Egyptologists who met and worked with her throughout the rest of her life. That being said, Dorothy's lack of a university education did incur some practical costs. She made no bones about this, and when she spoke to the BBC, she commented on the dynamic.
You see, I haven't got a degree from a university. Therefore, I couldn't be, among the high-class officials. So I was taken on as skilled workman.
What did that mean?
Well, it means not somebody who just digs and hauls stone about. I have done that. But it means somebody with a special skill.
Fortunately, archaeology and Egyptology are always in need of skilled hands, and Dorothy's passion for the subject, her evident expertise, and her commitment and readiness to do hard work put her in good stead when it came to the practical work of Egyptology. We'll come back to this in a moment. Dorothy Eady, Bulbul, remained in Cairo for 19 years. That may seem surprising. Today, Dorothy, or Omm Sety, is most associated with the town of Abydos and the great Temple of Sety I, located in that region. And yet, for nearly 2 decades, Dorothy Eady did not live at Abydos. In fact, she didn't even visit it. This discrepancy is noteworthy. In Jonathan Cott's biography, we get a comment on it. Quote, T.G.H. James of the British Museum commented, I've always found it puzzling that Dorothy Eady never got to Abydos until the 1950s. If Abydos was her place of pilgrimage, why hadn't she hopped on a train at some point? But then again, she might have been frightened of going. You know, very often you don't want to achieve your ultimate goal because it may turn out to be an anticlimax. So one doesn't want to be too hard on her. But the fact is that she came to Egypt with this aim in mind. So from the perspective of T.G.H. James, Dorothy Eady, Omm Sety, may have been hesitant to make that final pilgrimage. Perhaps it wouldn't be all that she had imagined, or perhaps the connection she sought would not manifest. Jonathan Cott's biography adds a quote from Omm Sety herself reflecting on the delay. He writes, quote, I only had one aim in life, she had often said, and that was to go to Abydos, to live in Abydos, and to be buried in Abydos. She had spent 19 years in Egypt, but something outside my power had stopped me from even visiting Abydos. When I was first married, I had the little boy on my hands, and when, early on, I was finally ready to make the journey, my son got the measles, and I had to stay home with him. Then my husband very kindly offered to let me take a trip from Cairo to Luxor. I think perhaps it was to get rid of me for a bit. I remember dumping the baby on his granny, going along to the ticket office, but the last train that was part of that package tour had left the day before. My financial position later on did not allow me to go gadding about the country. Finally, Jonathan Cott notes a professional aspect to Dorothy Eady's delay. He writes, quote, It should also be remembered that for the first 19 years that Dorothy had spent in Egypt, she had patiently set out to study, train, and work in Cairo, Giza, and Saqqara with the leading archaeologists and scholars of the day, in order to master the complicated and multifaceted discipline of Egyptology. For she desired not only to immerse herself in her favorite subject, but also to contribute something to it. End quote. So whatever it was exactly, a commitment to learning the trade, practical misfortunes or barriers to travel, or simply an emotional reticence, Dorothy Eady took 19 years to finally reach Abydos. Eventually, the day came at last. In 1952, Dorothy got permission and funding to make a brief trip to Abydos. This would be her first visit to the sacred site, and the story of her initial arrival is quite interesting. Quote, It was, as befitted Dorothy's arrival, a night of the full moon, with silvery light illuminating the irrigated fields, and the acacia and palm trees, and yellow pom-poms perfuming the air. Dorothy hopped off the train, as she put it, crossed the tracks, and with suitcase in hand, was about to head down the dirt road on her own when a man came running after her, calling her name. It turned out that he was one of the watchmen from the Antiquities department, who had been sent to look after her. He informed Dorothy that, unfortunately, there was no taxi available at the moment to drive them to Abydos, which was 8 miles away from the train station. He suggested they wait for one to arrive, but Dorothy was too impatient and told him, "I can walk. It's nothing." The watchman looked at her incredulously, lifted up her suitcase, and said, "In less than an hour it will be sunset. With such a heavy suitcase, we will never be able to cover the distance in less than 2.5 hours. The argument continued, but Dorothy had her way. The watchman attached the suitcase to a donkey's back, and he and Madame began walking down the road to Abydos. The watchman later recalled, "I had great difficulty keeping up with her. I have never seen a woman so stubborn and so strong. You know, our village women are quite healthy and robust, but none like her." They arrived at the inspector's rest house, the residence of the Antiquity Department's personnel, and Dorothy deposited her suitcase and then let it be known that she intended to visit the Temple of Sety right away. The watchman informed her that there were strict orders forbidding anyone to go inside the temple at night. Furious, Dorothy started swearing in her heavily English-accented Arabic. The watchman exclaimed, "Aren't you afraid of the Afarit, ghosts, that roam inside the temple at night? Nobody has ever dared to enter that place after sunset." Dorothy retorted, "Do not worry, ya Abid, you idiot. I am used to Afarit, or ghosts. They understand me better than people like you." The watchman laughed, replying, "If you meet the Afarit and cry for help, do not count on me." He opened the main gate of the temple. Immediately, Dorothy took off her shoes and made obeisance to the god Ptah, the creator deity of Memphis, the architect of heaven and earth, and the patron of artists and craftsmen. She made obeisance by bowing her head and extending her 2 hands forward, as was the ancient Egyptian custom. Then she went straight to the northern wall of the second hypostyle hall in the Great Sety Temple. Here was to be found a beautiful limestone relief depicting Sety burning incense and pouring a libation of water into 3 vases that were shaped like hearts. This was a play on the ancient Egyptian expression of washing the hearts, or fulfilling a long-desired wish or ambition. Here, like a visiting goddess, Dorothy Eady spent the rest of the night burning incense for and praying to Osiris and Isis, her favoured god and goddess who had brought her out of the land of England. The next morning, when she emerged from the temple, the watchman swore that she looked 20 years younger, and she even had a few nice and kind words of gratitude for me. End quote. It's a good story, a lively and vivacious tale that gives a sense of Omm Sety's determination. Whether this story is accurate, I leave up to you. This was Dorothy's first visit to Abydos. It would be another 2 years before her second, and another 2 years following that before she finally made the move. In 1956, Dorothy Eady left Cairo for good. She boarded a train, travelled south to Abydos, and started her new life. Or, depending on your perspective, she revisited her old one. At this point, the tale of Dorothy Eady really comes to its final end, and the tale of Omm Sety begins in earnest. Why does she have that name, Omm Sety? The answer is relatively simple. During her early marriage to Imam Abd el-Meguid, Dorothy gave birth to a son. She named that son Sety, and thus, in Egyptian and Arabic convention, she earned the epithet Omm. Omm, or simply translates as mother. So Omm Sety is the mother of Sety. The name comes from her role as a mother, just as her earlier epithet, Bulbul, had come from her role as wife. That is a reflection of the society in which she had chosen to live. But that, at a very basic level, is the origin of her name. Anyway, Dorothy Eady, Omm Sety, moved to Abydos in 1956. She would live here for the rest of her life. Having arrived in Abydos, Omm Sety quickly set up a home. She purchased a small, one-room house for $75. Later, she added a second floor to this, where she lived upstairs and her pet animals lived downstairs. Omm Sety gathered many animals in her time. First, she had a donkey named Alice. Then she got a male goose named Sneferu and a female named Nebet. She got a rabbit named Banuna and many, many cats. Omm Sety named all of her cats after ancient Egyptians, such as Teti Sheri, Ames or Amosa, Hor-Emheb or Horemheb, and Ramesses. She also gathered strays from around the neighborhood, and apparently she called her feline bodyguard her mafia. Of course, Omm Sety did not come to Abydos to gather animals. She came here for the temple. Speaking to the BBC, Omm Sety reflected on her connection with Seti's great monument.
What was your feeling when you first came here?
Well, I felt, first of all, I'd really come home. And again, that, I'd come to my holy place.
When you first walked inside the temple, what happened?
Well, it was as if I walked into a place where I had lived before and knew all about it.
So, from Omm Sety's perspective, this was not moving to a new home. It was a homecoming. More importantly, this was not a tourist visitation for Omm Sety. This was going to be her new home, and she embedded herself within the Abydos community. Again, speaking to the BBC, Omm Sety described her perspective.
Omm Sety, how do you like living here?
Oh, I love it. Life here is, it's not really plain sailing. Never is in any village. Life's hard here, but I wouldn't live anywhere else, having got here. You see, maybe I was an only child, and so I was accustomed to playing alone. I only feel lonely if there's no animals around. If there's animals around, I don't feel lonely.
Shortly after arriving in Abydos and setting up her new life, Omm Sety got back to work. In 1956, an archaeological project was underway at the great Temple of Sety I. This excavation was under the leadership of Edward Ghazzouli, and it focused on an area just to the south and east of the Great Temple. There, Ghazzouli's excavation uncovered an enormous mud brick complex. This seemed to include storage facilities and magazines associated with the Great Temple. It also may have had a small palace or reception room. You can see these mud brick buildings today. They are just south of the great courtyards in front of the Sety Temple, and if you sneak over the wall, you can take a look at the old complex. Omm Sety worked on this excavation. In particular, she worked on the inscribed pieces of stone or brick that used to adorn the buildings and needed reconstruction. In a later documentary, Omm Sety described this work.
They confronted me with a pile of fragments of inscribed stone. There were over 2,000. Some were very small, some were very big. My job was to copy the inscriptions on them, catalogue them, and where possible, fit them together.
This work she did, and did well. And subsequently, the excavator lead, Ghazzouli, acknowledged her contribution in the publication of the material. Commenting on this work later, Omm Sety associated it with her long-delayed journey to Abydos itself. Jonathan Cott writes, quote, "You see, I really couldn't have come to Abydos until I had learned properly the job that I was intended to accomplish here. In other words, I was meant to do something good for the temple, not just flap about it." Omm Sety's contribution to the Ghazzouli project is referenced in his publication, where he gives extended thanks to Bulbul Abd el-Meguid, and apparently she was responsible for much of the English grammar of the publication and the line drawings that appear within it. You can find a link to that publication in the episode description, and I've included some of Omm Sety's drawings in the booklet that goes along with this episode on Patreon. Anyway, Omm Sety did her work on that project for about 2 years. Following the project's end, Omm Sety remained in Abydos. She started to work in the Temple of Sety itself. She turned one of the rooms off in the corner into a personal office, and she spent much of her time documenting the temple and recording its inscriptions. She also found time to visit the nearby temple of Ramesses II, a monument that he had constructed just north of his father's complex. Apparently, Omm Sety copied the inscriptions and images in that temple, every single one of them that was currently visible. I haven't been able to find copies of her work there, but you could imagine this would be a massive undertaking. Quite a significant job. Once again, Omm Sety had her share of supernatural experiences in her new home. On one occasion, she was working in the temple. At the time, she was suffering from a flu, and having taken medication and a short rest, she decided today the work was not happening and she'd better go home. But apparently, Omm Sety had an accident. She used one of the staircases to climb up to the roof because that was the fastest way back to her home. While walking, though, Omm Sety became dizzy and fell, and apparently she woke up in some kind of underground chamber or crevice. There, Omm Sety claims to have been visited by the god Horus, who appeared before her and seemed quite surprised to find her there. Subsequently, Omm Sety made her way back up to the surface, but she was never able to locate this underground room or passage. To her credit, Omm Sety acknowledged that fully. She said, quote, 2 days later, the chief inspector of the Antiquities department came here, and I told him about this experience. He was very astonished and interested, but neither of us could decide if it had really happened or if it was just a hallucination caused by my fever. And to this day, I do not know for certain. All that I am sure of is that I did really fall. My ankle was swollen and painful for a week, and I had a large bruise on my shoulder. The chief inspector told me to find this crevice. I looked for it in every possible place in the temple, but with no results, except for some more bruises. Settling down in Abydos, Omm Sety began her new life, or returned to her old one. From here, she dedicated most of her time and effort to the great monuments of the region. She also participated and connected with her community. She was not an isolated tourist living out some fantasy. Omm Sety was part of the Abydos townscape, and she built her life there. One person with whom she developed a friendship was Hani el-Zaini, an industrial chemist that she met in 1956. Hani el-Zaini would become one of the biographers of Omm Sety. He contributed to Jonathan Cott's work, and he also collaborated with Omm Sety on her only published book, Abydos, the Holy City of Ancient Egypt. In that book, Omm Sety described all the great monuments of the Abydos townscape, including the Temple of Sety I, the Temple of Ramesses II, the Osirion, and the history of the region overall. Abydos, the Holy City of Egypt, is a wonderful book. It is full of excellent historical detail, and also many of Omm Sety's personal reflections and insights on the monuments. As we'll see in a moment, those reflections could be strikingly personal. Over the years, stories began to filter out to the wider world about this curious lady. Tourists visiting the temple would meet Omm Sety, and occasionally she would take them around Seti's great monument. She would explain the various images and hieroglyphs that tourists would see, and she would offer her personal insights to the temple itself and the historical figures contained within. For example, the King Ramesses II appears frequently within the monument of Sety. He appears both as a pharaoh in his own right, but also in his younger guise as a crown prince serving his father. Omm Sety had some thoughts on young Ramesses, and she described them to the BBC.
There was that feeling I've had at the beginning and always have had and can't get rid of. The idea that Ramses was a young boy, a young teenager, kid about 14 or 15. Older than he is in the reliefs, but still a youngster. And very active and energetic and rather noisy, but quite amiable.
She also had insights about the character of Sety himself.
And the father is always, to me, rather grave, rather serious, but very kind and gentle.
Omm Sety's perception of the King Sety was informed both by the reliefs and texts within his monument, but also by more personal experiences. Earlier, I referenced how Omm Sety experienced nighttime visitations, supposedly by the ghost of King Sety himself. In the 1970s, Omm Sety kept a diary, and in that she recorded additional visitations from Sety. Apparently, the king would come to her on some occasions during the night. She would be sleeping, and he would appear in her dreams. The two connected as friends, and apparently as lovers, and in some of her diaries she describes these encounters. For example, on the 20th of July 1972, Omm Sety wrote the following: "His Majesty, Sety, came to me last night at about 12:30 past midnight. After our usual affectionate greetings, Sety asked me if I was comfortable in my new house, to which I replied that I was. He said, 'I will see it with you.' He put his arm around my shoulder and we walked around the property. He said, 'I will open the mouth of each room and make it sacred.' His idea of this ceremony was to hold me close to him and kiss me on the mouth, although ever since I came to Abydos, he had only ever kissed my forehead, my cheek, or my hands. Then we went outside and sat down together, holding hands. Sety said that it is the best place that I have lived in, within Abydos." End quote. Omm Sety also records conversations with the king on a variety of topics. They discuss the gods, including Seth, the namesake of Sety, and the arch-enemy of Osiris. They talk about Akhenaten and his difficult reputation. They discuss the festivals of Osiris, and how these should be performed to honor the god. You can find all of these diary entries in Jonathan Cott's book. I'll read a small selection of them at the end of the episode, but you can find the full story there. The nighttime visitations are another important component in Omm Sety's tale. I can't find many references to her discussing these in public. They seem to have been relatively private, and she did not share them with many people. But apparently it was important to her. Of course, thanks to her many years in Abydos, Omm Sety's relationships extended beyond her local community and the nighttime visitations of King Sety. She also formed associations and friendships with many Egyptologists and researchers. Scholars visiting or working in the Abydos region would spend time with Omm Sety, and she was a frequent guest at many dig houses. Jonathan Cott's biography includes a variety of anecdotes about scholars meeting and knowing Omm Sety on a personal level. These anecdotes are quite consistent in their praise for Omm Sety's expertise, her clear devotion to the Sety Temple and Abydos monuments, and her generally likable personality and way of dealing with others. I won't read every anecdote, but here is a small selection. Professor William Murnane of the University of Memphis wrote the following, quote, "It was always a pleasure to be with Omm Sety, and to listen to whatever she said. You really couldn't take her anything but seriously, but there was a certain element of mischievousness about her, and you never knew when she might be pulling your leg." On her expertise as an Egyptologist, Professor William Kelly Simpson from Yale University had the following to say, quote, "Dorothy Eady knew a great deal of Egyptology. She wasn't a totally trained Egyptologist, but then again, who is? Some people know the Egyptian language backwards and forwards, but don't have a sense of Egyptian art. Others know Egyptian art, but not the language. Dorothy Eady knew them both. She was a delightful person, very peppery, and opinionated in her own way. I found her a wonderful and nice person to work with." When it came to her deep spiritual and personal connection with the Temple of Sety I, Professor Kenneth Kitchen from the University of Liverpool had this interesting perspective. Quote, "You know, there is a certain truth to that familial approach of hers. The Temple of Sety is Sety's local Abydos memorial temple, and it commemorates his father, Ramesses I, in parts. Ramesses II also appears in the temple as a prince, and then he himself finished the work on it as pharaoh. And his son completed the Osirion, while adding a few things over there. And his son, a great-grandson of Sety I, contributed a few inscriptions at the back of the shrine. So there is a family thread going right through that temple." Finally, her personal fieriness comes through in a quote from Peter Lacovara. We interviewed Dr. Lacovara on the podcast recently, and he generously shared some anecdotes via email. Dr. Lacovara writes, "I first met Omm Sety working with David O'Connor at Abydos in the fall and winter of 1979. She was a frequent visitor to dinner with the crew at the dig house, which she had named O'Connor's Kremlin, on account of the Nubian domes that he used in its construction. Omm Sety would discuss Egyptological topics and stories about her life in Egypt with David and the rest of us around the long dinner table. She had many amusing stories of her time in Egypt that she would recount. She was ardently pro-Egyptian, and she went to Cairo to see the British flag lowered over the citadel and the occupying troops marching out of the city. While watching the parade, one woman yelled at her, "Get out of here, you English whore!" And Omm Sety replied to her in perfect colloquial Arabic, "Don't worry, I'm leaving, so you can have all my customers." End quote. Nowadays, we'd call that kind of comeback an emotional damage. Jonathan Cott recalls the same anecdote, but in his version, Omm Sety's reply is, "And leave all the customers to you?" If the anecdote is true, Omm Sety seems to have been quite good with the repartee. Now, you may be wondering, what did all of these Egyptologists make of Omm Sety's private, personal beliefs? What did they make of the idea of reincarnation? The answer may surprise you. On this subject, Kenneth Kitchen wrote the following, quote, "About the matter of Omm Sety's belief in reincarnation, that was a personal matter. She was a charming person, she loved the temple, and she was on the side of the ancient Egyptians, and cared for their history, which is what Egyptologists are supposed to do. She was so transparent in her character, and had such a curious history herself, when you come to think of it, that you couldn't help liking her. My attitude was, that's how she thinks. Well, fair enough. She's entitled to her personal view of life. It's all right. Make that allowance, and there is no problem." Omm Sety came to all sorts of perfectly sensible conclusions about the actual objective material of the Sety temple, because she had time on the site that 99% of us don't have, and that paid dividends. So even in a minimal interpretation, Omm Sety had the opportunity to make many quiet little observations. Never mind the last life, this one was quite enough. End quote. Similarly, I quoted a text from Klaus Bayer earlier, who mentioned that Dorothy Eady never proselytized or tried to convince anyone of her particular beliefs. She was personally committed to the ancient Egyptian gods, but she was well in tune with scholarship and its methods, and she never tried to convince anyone that what she was saying was fundamentally or physically true. It was her belief, but she wasn't going to force it. Peter Lacovara also adds a comment on this particular subject. Quote, "She was extremely professional and knowledgeable, and never discussed reincarnation or such things. I always thought that story was part of the cultivated English eccentricity of her age, and largely for entertaining the tourists." End quote. Whether that assessment is accurate or not, only Omm Sety knows. But on this particular subject, she did speak to the BBC and offered some perspective on what might have happened to her as a child.
I mean, if I had a screw loose, I might dream about a temple, but not that one particular temple and dream about it correctly. And then some people have suggested I might really have been dead, and an ancient spirit got in.
What do you think?
I think probably that might be.
So in her more speculative moments, Omm Sety did consider that maybe her accident as a child had briefly killed her, and that in some capacity an ancient spirit may have taken over her body. Your interpretation of that will depend on your view of reality and the world in which we inhabit, but Omm Sety was tentative at best on that particular interpretation. Again, Omm Sety seems to have been relatively private with this aspect of her life. She did discuss it, and Egyptologists reference this, but it also does not appear that she was trying to convince anyone, and she certainly wasn't interested in being an object of fascination or a target of pilgrimage. Speaking to the BBC, Omm Sety had this to say.
A lot of people know your name and come to see you. Do you feel as if they're rather making a pilgrimage to you?
No. You see, sometimes people have written articles about me in the paper. Usually quite a lot of nonsense. And then people read these, and they want to see the horrible specimen in life. And then people who come on cruises sort of met me here. And then they mention me as being sort of among the monuments to their friends. So when they come, they want to see me.
Again, that self-deprecating humour shines through. So Omm Sety was not particularly interested in being the object of foreign fascination. Ultimately, her devotion lay with the temples of Abydos and the community that surrounded them. And reflecting on her time at Abydos and how much time she had spent within these monuments, Omm Sety did have an interesting takeaway.
Well, I suppose I became so familiar. I will say, if God ever preserve it from happening, if the temple fell down, I think I could tell them where all the stones go to put it back again.
So just as her spiritual connection to the temple ran deep, her intellectual connection was equally as strong. In the entire history of Egyptology, Omm Sety probably has the strongest claim to be the person that best knew the Temple of Sety I. After the break, the tale of Omm Sety continues. Into her later years, her devotions to the Osiris religion and the great temples of Abydos, and, ultimately, her legacy. That is after the break. See you in a moment. Having moved to Abydos in the 1950s, Omm Sety remained there for the rest of her life, and the community became her social and spiritual home. Now that she lived in Abydos full-time, Omm Sety could devote herself to the object of her fascination, the great temple of Sety I, and the religion of Osiris, to which she was increasingly devoted. According to Jonathan Cott's biography, in 1957, Omm Sety composed a personal calendar that listed the ancient Egyptian feast days and the prayers and ceremonial duties to perform for each one. Cott also writes, quote, "Having access to the temple now whenever she wished, Omm Sety would go to the shrine every morning and evening, remove her shoes before entering, walk to the great hall, and then burn incense and pray to the Lord of the Dead. On the birthdays of Osiris and Isis, and on the great feast of Osiris, marked on her calendar as being celebrated between the 23rd and the 30th days of the month of Khoiak, January 3rd to 8th, she would observe the ancient custom of not eating fish, beans, onions, or garlic before crossing the threshold of the God's mountain, and she would bring offerings of beer, wine, bread, and tea biscuits to the cult chapel of Osiris. Here she would recite the Lament of Isis and Nephthys that she had learned in its English version more than 30 years before in England." End quote. Omm Sety was devoted to the temple and the religion that it represented, and this is an important factor to consider in her psychology and her life. Fundamentally, Omm Sety believed in the ancient rituals and the gods whom they honored, and she put that belief into practice, making regular offerings to the deities and worshipping within the Sety temple. Later in life, Omm Sety described her feelings towards this monument in a documentary.
How do you feel now you've arrived back
Oh,
after
I
so
feel
many months?
marvelous.
What are your feelings about it?
Indescribable. You're not committed to anything, you know, by burning this.
How do you feel now you're in the temple
I
again?
feel wonderful and so grateful. I was beginning to think I'd never see it again in this life.
Yes.
See it in the next one.
In the same documentary, filmed just before she died, Omm Sety also explained her religious practices.
Oh, yes, every year at the great feast, and again on the birthday of the gods Osiris and Isis, I come here with offerings of wine, bread, and incense. Oh, I love coming here. You know, it's a place I really do feel at home.
Beyond her Egyptological work and her religious devotion to the temple, Omm Sety's life in Abydos was not empty. She gathered many animals around her, as we reported earlier, and, of course, she made friends among her neighbours and the people of her town. Some of those neighbours have commented on the life of Omm Sety, and these are available in Arabic on YouTube, with English translations. I'll put a link in the episode description. Finally, Omm Sety made friends and associates among the Egyptological community. We have already heard from them, reflecting on her personality and their interactions with her. Suffice to say, most of the Egyptologists who met Omm Sety had nothing but praise for her commitment to the Abydos landscape, her sincerity of belief, and her genuine passion for hard work and scholarship. As far as I can tell, there only seem to be a couple of negative comments, and they largely come down to personality clashes or social interactions. The point is, I have not found any genuine criticism of her work, and surprisingly little of her beliefs. As far as I can tell, the general consensus is that Omm Sety was entirely sincere in the stories she told, but she wasn't looking to convince anyone of their truthfulness. She was not a grifter seeking fame or money for telling her story. Simply put, she believed what she believed, and she was going to live her life quietly according to that. But those beliefs were hers, and they did not concern anyone else. In the decades she lived in Abydos, Omm Sety continued to have her spiritual and emotional experiences. In particular, the nighttime visitations by the ghost of King Sety I continued throughout her life. In Jonathan Cott's biography, there is a series of diary entries written by Omm Sety during the 1970s, and they describe some of her meetings with Sety, her conversations with him about various subjects of ancient Egyptian history and religion. There are many of these entries, and some of them get quite personal. I've included a few at the end of the episode on interesting topics like Sety and the great god Seth, the religion of Osiris and Isis, and the pharaoh Akhenaten. These will be of interest to anyone listening to the recent historical episodes, and it's nice to get Omm Sety's perspective on those ancient events. I have included those at the end of the episode. Omm Sety died in 1981 on April 21st. Apparently, she had been aware that her death was imminent for some time. She had dreamt of Egyptian deities associated with the afterlife, and she had suffered repeated bouts of illness. Preparing for her afterlife, Omm Sety had commissioned a tomb. She had constructed a small monument in the Abydos neighborhood where she lived, and apparently she hoped to be buried within this small monument as a way to be close to the Temple of Sety I forevermore. Sadly, Omm Sety's wishes did not go fulfilled. Government restrictions on placing a grave within a residential zone meant that, ultimately, Omm Sety was laid to rest in a nearby cemetery. Following her passage to the west, Omm Sety has enjoyed the sort of afterlife that many ancient Egyptians would crave. Her name is well known both within her community and internationally. She is respected both as a patron of the Sety Temple and an Egyptologist in her own right. Her hard work and contribution to numerous excavations are deserving of recognition, and her deep personal devotion to the Abydos community and monuments is something all Egyptologists should praise. For some, the ultimate question will always be, was Omm Sety genuinely the reincarnation of an ancient Egyptian girl? Personally, I think that is the wrong question. Whether you believe in reincarnation or not, what truly matters is what Omm Sety did with the life she had. Omm Sety made her own path, both as an individual and as an Egyptologist. She was not blessed with ready access to a university education or to abundant resources to fund her passions, and yet she built a meaningful life within the village of Abydos, and she made genuine contributions to archaeology and scientific Egyptology. Fundamentally, she was a genuine guardian of the ancient monuments. She was committed to understanding them, more than committed to preserving them, and her contributions are part of the Abydos story. Whether Omm Sety's 20th century life was her first or her second, what she did with that life is worthy of recognition and praise. I'll leave you with a quote from Omm Sety about Abydos itself. For those who love her, Abydos still has a mysterious life. Other ears than mine have heard music at night in the hypostyle halls of the Temple of Sety. The tinkle of Systrums, the beat of a tambourine, and the wail of a reed pipe have been heard. I have seen the golden glow of a lamp in the cult chapel of Osiris, when no lamp was lit, and I have stood alone at night on the first evening of the great feast of Osiris, listening to the howling of the jackals. But when midnight came, the cries of the jackals were hushed, a deep silence fell, and then suddenly I felt as though I were surrounded by a great multitude of people. I could see nothing but the starlit desert, but all around me I could hear the breathing of many people, and the soft whisper of sandaled feet upon the sand. I walked in the midst of this unseen crowd, right up to the walls of Kom el-Sultan, the old Temple of Osiris. Then it seemed as though all the people went through the gateway and vanished into the past, and I was left outside, cold and lonely in the present. If there is justice or ma'at in the cosmos, then Omm Sety has made her way to the field of reeds. She has entered the kingdom of Osiris, and now she enjoys the blessings of that great god, and the light of Ra when he passes through the underworld. Her body is at rest, but her name, and the temple to which she was devoted, they endure. Thank you for listening to The Tale of Omm Sety. There was so much more that I could have covered. Alas, time is against us. If you are interested to learn more about her life, I can recommend Jonathan Cott's biography, The Search for Omm Sety. And if you are interested in her work and her abundant knowledge of the Abydos landscape, her book, Abydos, the Holy City of Ancient Egypt, written in cooperation with Hani El-Zaini, is an excellent resource. Omm Sety is a fascinating figure, and I enjoyed telling her story. Hopefully we'll see her again, perhaps when we discuss the monuments of Ramesses II at Abydos, or at the very least, when we chart the long history of Egyptology as an object of emotional or spiritual fascination, and as a scientific discipline. Omm Sety was an excellent example of both. Before I go, allow me to give an extra special thank you to the priests. These top-tier supporters on patreon.com earn a shout-out at the end of every episode. Shamefully, I have missed that shout-out in the past few episodes. The Temple of Sety I and the sheer volume of research and material I had to cover kind of overwhelmed me, and this particular thing slipped my mind. Hopefully, when it is my time to stand before Osiris and weigh my heart against the feather of justice, this oversight will not weigh too heavily. To the priests, thank you dearly for your support, and for your patience. Special thanks must go to Veronica, Paul, Ashley, Martha, Stephen, Nadine, Kyla, Evan, Kendra, Andy and Chelsea, Mycost, Yola, TJ, Terry, and Linda. Folks, you are too kind. May Osiris and Isis, the great deities of Abydos, bless you and your family. May Horus be always guarding you, and may an army of mafia cats watch over your property. To everyone listening, thank you for joining me. Onwards to the next chapter. Before we go, a quick note. The podcast narrative will be taking a break for at least 8 weeks. This is so I can travel abroad to celebrate my wedding and then my honeymoon. Narrative episodes will resume in November. In the meantime, I have a series of episodes related to the new video game, Total War Pharaoh. In that video game, players can undertake great wars of conquest across Egypt, Nubia, the Near East, and Anatolia. At the end of the 19th dynasty and the period of the late Bronze Age collapse. Total War Pharaoh is an exciting release coming in October 2023, and I have partnered with the developers, Creative Assembly, to produce some contextual episodes to help introduce the game and its characters. We'll meet figures like Merneptah, Ramesses III, Seti II, Amenmesse, and the Canaanite and Hittite leaders who played a role in these great events. If you are interested in Total War Pharaoh, and why wouldn't you be, these episodes will help set the scene and provide greater context for your wars of conquest. Keep an eye out for that over the next few weeks. Otherwise, take care, may the great gods bless you, and I will see you soon. And now, a brief epilogue, in which I read some of Omm Seti's diary entries, where she discusses topics such as ancient Egyptian gods, the pharaoh Akhenaten, and the proper performance of festivals for the god Osiris. These are quoted in Jonathan Cott's biography, The Search for Omm Sety. On July 20th, 1972, Omm Sety had a visitation from the ghost of King Seti I. This is presented in Cott's biography, starting on page 103. Quote, "Presently I, Omm Sety, said to the king, 'My beloved lord, will you tell me some things about the gods?' To which he replied, 'I will, if I am able to.' I said, 'Have you ever seen Seth, the evil brother of Osiris?' Seti looked at me and then looked away, with a very strange expression on his face, but he did not reply. I was afraid I had made him angry, and said, 'If what I asked has angered you, Lord, be gracious and pardon me.' He said, 'I am not angry. I will tell you. I have seen Seth once. That was during my life on earth, when I was a young man. Do you know that I was once a priest of Seth?' I replied that I did, and that a stela still existed, which Ramesses had made, recording the family history. Seti smiled and said, 'The mouth of Ramesses was always as big as his nose.' He said that for hundreds of years, all the men of his family had been military men, and that most of them were also priests of Seth, whom they adored as a god of war and the patron deity of their district. Seti said, 'This is not a good thing. One should not serve an evil being, even if it appears to have a good or useful attribute or function. Many of my companions in the military school were also training for the priesthood of Seth, but they did not take their studies to their hearts. Most of them only passed their initiation because the god had too few servants. I took everything to my heart. By day, I studied and exercised in the military school. At night, I did not sit in the beer houses or run after women. I studied the cult of the Lord of Strength, and I studied the magic powers that he offered. It is because of what I learned at this time that I am now able to come to you in the form of a living man. But those things I could have learned in the service of other gods.' After 2 years had passed, I asked to be allowed to try and enter the first gate. The chief priest agreed. For 10 days I ate no meat and drank only water. On the 11th day I fasted. 1 hour after sunset, I was taken to the chapel of the Great of Strength, another name for Seth, that was lit by a lamp with 3 wicks. In a niche or serek in the western wall was a statue of the god, a man with the head of a strange animal. I was told to kneel in front of the statue and repeat the god's name. I was not to rise from the floor. I was not to leave the chapel. I was then left alone. I did as I was ordered. After some time, I felt the earth tremble. There was a terrible noise like thunder, and a bright light came from the niche. Instead of the painted wooden statue, there stood the god himself. He was a beauty that cannot be described. His hair was as red as new copper. His eyes were as green as the great ocean. But he seemed to be the spirit and soul of all that is cruel and evil. His voice was evil music when he said, "Come to me, my son and servant." I jumped to my feet, and I screamed, "Never will I serve you." I opened the door and fled from the chapel. As I did, I heard the terrible, mocking laughter of the god. The priests were waiting in the courtyard, and they cried, "Praised be to the Lord of Strength. He has revealed his face to his servant." They guessed what had happened, but they thought that my flight was caused by religious ecstasy. The next day, the chief priest wrote my name in the records as a Wab priest, or pure priest, of Seth. But I swear to you, beloved, that I refused to enter his chapel again, and I never served him, even for 1 hour. "Did you ever serve him again?" I asked. "No," Sety replied. "I have never seen him, but often I have heard his terrible laughter. I heard it on the day when my eldest son went to his death. I heard it on the night when I learned of your death. I heard it as I left the court of our Lord Osiris, after I had been condemned to wait in sorrow and loneliness for your return. How often during those thousands of weary years I have lain sleepless on my bed, my body and soul in agony, longing for you, and I have cried your name aloud in the night, and I have heard, like an echo, that terrible, mocking laughter." End quote. The story broadly accords with what we know about the cult of Seth during the 19th dynasty. We know that temples to the god were relatively few, although they did exist in the far north, in the region around Avaris. We'll discuss that in a future episode. We also know that the name of the god Seth was sometimes Great of Strength, or A'apechti. These are all details that Omm Sety would have known from her Egyptological studies. Finally, the reference to King Sety having an eldest son that died. That is an interesting case. For many decades, scholars thought Sety might have had an elder son, one born before Prince Ramesses. Subsequently, it transpired this son was probably a misinterpretation of a relief on one of the king's temple scenes. Again, I'll talk about that in the future when we get to the appropriate moment. But suffice to say, the idea that Sety had an eldest son, other than Ramesses II, was current up until approximately the 1980s. Subsequently, Egyptologists have revised their interpretations of the evidence, and now that son is no longer considered historical. I'll leave the significance of that up to you, but it's a fun detail. The second story concerns the pharaoh Akhenaten, whose reputation and legacy among the Egyptian rulers is controversial at best. On December 18, 1973, Omm Sety's diary recorded a discussion about Akhenaten with the nighttime ghost of King Sety. This tale appears on page 115 in Cott's biography. Quote, "His Majesty, Sety, came last night at about 11:30 p.m. I asked him what he knew about Akhenaten. He frowned and replied, 'Why do you ask about that evil man?' I said that his character, although bad in our eyes, was interesting, and that the local overseer, my friend Hani el-Zayani, was interested to know more about Akhenaten. Then Sety smiled and said, 'For the pleasure of the overseer, your friend, I will tell you what I know. I myself once asked why Akhenaten's guard, Hathor, deserted from the bodyguard about 1 year before the criminal died. They could not endure the conditions of life in his city, and they said that certainly the curse of Amun had fallen on the king and driven him mad. Kai Seneb, an old retired general of Sety's time, who as a young officer had served under Akhenaten, said that a story went around the soldiers that just before Akhenaten died, he said that his god had changed him into a young woman, and that he had taken poison in order to go as a pure virginal bride to his god. But I, living as I did in the north, ancient Memphis, never heard of this, and it was generally believed that Hor-Em-Heb, the commander of the Egyptian army, and I, the royal counselor, had killed Akhenaten in order to save Egypt. I, Omm Sety, asked His Majesty whether Akhenaten had a sickness, which modern doctors believe might have made him impotent, and whether his daughters were not really his at all, but maybe they were the children of Amenhotep III. Sety laughed and said, "No, I never heard of such a story, and I do not think that is true. Perhaps the last 2 girls were not his, as by that time Nefertiti hated him, and she may well have taken a lover. But if that was so, she covered her secret well, and the criminal, Akhenaten, believed that he had fathered those children. If that story had been true, all Egypt would have known about it, for as you know, the Rekit people, or commoners, dearly love to hear of such scandals in high places. But I will ask the spirit of Kai Seneb if he had ever heard of this matter. and when I visit you again, I will tell you more what happened in that cursed city, Akhet Aten or Amana. But I am sure you will be very angry. Now kiss me, for I must leave and go back to my guests, and your kisses on my lips will make the wine taste all the sweeter." I duly obeyed the royal command, and he left. End quote. The speculation on Akhenaten's possible fragility or illness was a common feature of Egyptological scholarship right up until the modern day. It's only in the past couple of decades that scholars have really wondered if Akhenaten was physically quite healthy, but was suffering more in a mental sense. The perception of Akhenaten changes depending on the social and political winds of the time, and I've covered that in my episodes about Akhenaten. But Omm Seti's perspective, or the perspective that the ghost of King Seti revealed to her, is an interesting one, full of scandalous gossip and all sorts of speculation about the political landscape of the time. Finally, on January the 2nd, 1976, Omm Seti had another dream in which the king visited her. This time, she described the great feast of Osiris, which was about to occur. Quote, "Today, January 2nd, is the first day of the great feast of Osiris, and His Majesty came last night to remind me to go to the house of Men Ma'at Ra, that is, the Temple of Sety I. What a time we had! I thought at one point that we had made enough noise to wake the entire village. When he first appeared, I was still awake, having worked late. All of the cats rushed out of the room, except the kitten, Khufu, who was afraid, but stood staring at His Majesty and spitting before she too ran. Seti had noticed her, and after the usual fond greetings he said, 'You have a very pretty little cat. She looks like a small lion.' I agreed, and I asked how were Ramesses' pet lions. He started to laugh and said, 'The last time my son visited me, he brought me his favorite lion, named Amet, the Devourer. I could smell its stink before it came through the door. Therefore, I told Ramesses to take the lion out to the courtyard, where my men would care for it. This he did. We were seated together in my room, which you, my little one, know, and after some time we heard a noise from outside, a sound of men laughing and shouting, a most unusual thing. Ramesses was not pleased. He went out to see the cause of the noise. Then he came back, and he was laughing loudly. He told me that the husband of Ankri, who is overseer of all my horses, and some of the men from the stables were trying to make his lion eat bread dipped in beer. They told him that the lion had eaten 2 loaves of bread like a true warrior, but had spit out the third and refused to eat any more. We both laughed about that. Then His Majesty said, 'Now, little one, do you know that in the morning you have to celebrate the feast of our Lord Osiris?' I replied that I had remembered and prepared everything, and I told him that I had forgotten the days of the feasts for the birthdays of Osiris and Isis until the time had passed. He said, 'I know you forgot, you bad girl. Because I could not come and remind you, you cannot remember? Oh, bad, bad, bad.' And he gently slapped my face. I did not ask how he knew that I had forgotten. Probably Ka-Em-Waset, the 4th son of Ramesses II, had learned this and told him. Then Seti gave me a lot of kisses to make up for the slap, and he said that he would come and visit me again during the feast. I asked if he was going to hold his usual banquet for his friends, and he said that he was. Then he said that on the 2nd night of the celebration, he was making a big feast for his soldiers, and that they were all going to dance. I was astonished. I could not imagine Seti dancing. He said, "You silly girl, do you not know that all of us, officers and soldiers, have a war dance? This we have done since the time of the ancestors." I said that I would love to see that dance, and he said, "I will show you, but you must beat on the drum for me." I said that I did not have a drum, but he said that the table would do, and he showed me how to beat 10 fairly rapid, even beats, and then one big bang and a pause. I tried it, and at the second go, I got it right. Then Seti took off his robe and stood in his underpants and said, "Begin." What a surprise I had! I had no idea the king could dance, and so well. The dance consisted of quick movements, and with the big bang, he suddenly stood still in the position of an archer taking aim, or a spearman about to throw his spear, or a man about to use his war axe or mace. Some of the quick movements consisted of spinning round with arms stretched out sideways, jumping up and down with arms raised like the Ka hieroglyph, and the fists clenched, raising each knee rapidly, also with the arms raised, running but standing in one place with one arm stretched out in front and making a chopping motion as though using an axe. These movements were repeated over and over again, gradually getting faster and finally ending in a jump and finishing with a shout. It was a fine dance, but my room is rather small, and I thought that at any moment he would crash into the cupboard. After that, Sety put on his robe and said, "Now, let a poor old man get under your nice warm blanket and have a rest." I praised his dancing, and he seemed pleased, but he said that Ramesses did it much better, especially the jumps. After a lot of silly talk, we went to sleep. He left just before 5 a.m., and he set the dogs howling and barking." End quote. In Sety's dance, Omm Sety describes him punctuating his movements with specific poses, like an archer taking aim, a spearman about to throw his spear, or a man raising a war axe or mace. Curiously, these are the sort of images you would find on temple walls, especially the exterior, where the king will raise a mace to strike a prisoner, or raise a bow to hunt animals or in battle, or raise his spear during the hunt and a fight. Picturing these images, you can presumably get the idea of how Sety's dance appeared to Omm Sety. In another of her recollections, she describes additional elements to the priesthood and celebration of the Osiris religion. Again, this is in Cott's biography. Quote, "In the play, the part of Osiris was taken by a life-sized wooden statue of the god, adorned with gold and semi-precious stones. The role of Horus was traditionally performed by the king himself, although he sometimes delegated this honor to some important official. The other gods were personified by the priests and priestesses, and it was stipulated that women who played the parts of Isis and Nephthys must be virgins. The crowd, quote-unquote, representing the followers of Osiris and the followers of Seth, were played by certain members of the crowd themselves, who fought together with stripped palm branches, and one wonders how many heads were broken and how many old scores were paid off. Each episode of the play took place on a separate day and in a separate place, but the murder of Osiris was too sacred, too tragic and harrowing for public presentation, and this took place inside the temple. The search for the body of Osiris, however, was enacted on the banks of the canal, where the original incident was supposed to have occurred. The two women impersonating Isis and Nephthys, their hair unbound and their faces and robes smeared with mud, ran wailing along the banks of the waterway. Finally, they found, quote-unquote, the god lying on the ground. Isis threw herself upon him, weeping and lamenting, and the two goddesses together sang the heart-rending hymn, the lament of Isis and Nephthys. To the pilgrims, it was as if the ancient tragedy were taking place before their very eyes. After all, this was the same canal beside which Osiris was slain. Over yonder were the same unchanged mountains to which the real Isis had raised her tear-stained face. And sometimes, even today, when the wind blows across the ruins of Abydos, one can imagine that it echoes with the sobs and wails of the pilgrims mourning for their murdered god. Anyway, as Horus Ra continued my story, I was told about King Sety I's visit to Abydos in order to inspect the work on his temple, and about how he passed by the garden and saw young Bent Reshit collecting some flowers. The rest, you know. Thanks for listening.